Of the bloody pages of the Tudor past, few executions are so appalling in their violence as that inflicted upon Francis Dereham in 1541. While King Henry VIII is remembered for his swift beheadings of wives and political opponents, the fate of Dereham is singular, one not merely to kill but to destroy. This was not so much royal justice as a display of vengeance. His crime? Not treason exactly, but something 1,000 times worse. Once he had loved Catherine Howard, long before she became Henry's fifth wife. One sin, that adolescent crush, would seal his fate for destruction in the most vicious way imaginable. The punishment that followed was so vicious that even brutalized Tudor courtiers gasped with horror, a grisly message from an apoplectic king. This was not just the conclusion of a life. This was more to make an example so remembered that no one would ever again challenge the crown. In an era in which public hangings filled the dual role of warning and bizarre entertainment, Dereham's execution was intended to outdo them all for sheer brutality. No matter how much he assured that his affair with Catherine had long been over, before her marriage with the king, his history was now warrant for his death. His shrieks would be a public declaration. The reputation of the king was sacred, and anything to tarnish it would be met with merciless reprisal. In order to fully appreciate the nightmare Dereham experienced, we need to first step into the volatile political landscape of England in 1541. Henry VIII had already created a chilling legacy at this point. 2 wives executed, dozens of nobles murdered, and a court in a constant state of fear. The marriage with Catherine Howard was supposed to be one of rebirth, the final flicker of hope at producing a male heir. But when Catherine's past transgressions became rumors in the ears of the king, all was lost. Gossip ruined Henry's pride and ignited a whirlwind of paranoia that would consume all who were associated with her past. The court during 1541 was a hazardous one, where excess could be transformed into death within a night. And now the anger of the king was directed at a former lover who had once dared to place hands on something that Henry now claimed as his own. The betrayal Henry felt went beyond mere jealousy. It reached his ego, his masculinity, and godlike rank as monarch. To him, anyone who had known Catherine prior to him hadn't only offended his pride, they had committed treason against the throne of England itself. Francis Dereham's history only serves to deepen the tragedy. The son of a minor noble house, he worked for the Howard family, where he became friends with a young, lively Catherine Howard. Their affair, though passionate, was not out of the ordinary between young nobility establishing themselves in court society. Dereham was no plotter or subversive figure, himself a lovesick young man. His sole failing was in believing the past could stay hidden. But nothing was hidden for very long within Henry's court. The chain of events that led to Dereham's arrest began with the standard poison of Tudor politics, gossip. With court gossip becoming accepted chat about Catherine's previous relations, Henry's intelligence network and interrogators entered into action. Everyone who ever knew the Queen was brought in front of an inquisition marked by coercion and torture. Dereham, among many others, was taken under arrest and grilled non-stop about his relationship with Catherine. Despite his protests that their affair had been ended months before the king fell in love with her, he was already bound for death. His fate was not merely an unfortunate accident, it was a guarantee. The charges against him were framed with precise aim to secure the maximum penalty. By the Treason Act of 1534, concealment of a queen's sex life from the king was regarded as high treason, an act that could be punished by the most gruesome forms of execution. The law specifically framed to Henry's jealousies had already wreaked havoc on many lives, and Francis Dereham was about to become its most infamous victim. Francis Dereham's prosecutors had argued that his silence was treason, that by not disclosing his relationship with Catherine Howard before her marriage to the king, he had undermined the very basis of the realm. They alleged that he had jeopardized the royal succession and the legitimacy of Henry's rule. But the outcome of Dereham's trial was always a foregone conclusion. The trial was no more than a charade, a thin gloss of legality thrown over a preordained judgment. The alleged proof was nothing but terrorized confessions and shards of truth twisted by fear. Dereham's own words, extracted under intense torture, were turned against him. His argument that the affair had been over long before Catherine had taken the throne, and he had no need to reveal intimate, teenage transgressions, was systematically disregarded. No one dared oppose the king's rage. Guilt was a royal judgment, not a legal one, in a court paralyzed by terror. And so the sentence fell: high treason, which would be punished with one of history's most ghastly deaths ever conceived. This was not about justice. It was about show. Dereham, being taken to his death, must have had a very good idea what horrors awaited him. Death for traitors in Tudor England was not the swift beheading. It was public ritual of slow, methodical torture that would keep life lingering just long enough for the crowds to see every second of agony. He would be dragged through the streets on a wooden hurdle, humiliated and exposed to jeering crowds. At the gallows, he would be hanged, but not killed. No, the rope was not meant to break the neck, just to strangle, to choke him nearly unconscious, but not quite. The job of the executioner was to make it take longer, not make it quicker, and from there the fear would mount. Dereham's body, just clinging to life, would be hacked down, naked, and laid out for the appalling ritual to continue. Still alive, he would be disemboweled, his insides ripped from his body in full view of the spectators, castrated, beheaded, quartered, each step more gruesome than the last. His entrails would be flung onto flames before his dying eyes. This was a murder meant not just to destroy, but to terrify. Tyburn, that bloody execution ground, had seen its share of gore. But on December 10th, 1541, the population believed they were in for something out of the ordinary in cruelty. The stage had been set, gallows, fire pits, knives honed to perfection, and a legion of executioners trained to cause agony with great care. The crown had instructed it be remembered, a terrible spectacle of royal authority. As Dereham was pulled along the icy, muddy roads of London, attached to the hurdle, onlookers from all walks of life waited in curiosity and fear. Nobles, merchants, artisans, and laborers filled the streets, drawn by the combination of horror and fascination. In a world hardened to public executions, this one promised something particularly horrific. When he came, Dereham was hoisted onto the gallows. The rope, consciously positioned, was not designed to bring peace, but fear. It choked him, cut off the oxygen to his lungs, and suspended him in a state of limbo between living and dying. The executioner measured it with agonizing accuracy, just enough to make him suffer, not enough to end it. And so the real torture began. Struck down but still alive, Dereham was stripped and left to the mob. His own breathing was gasping, his mind likely reeling in horror and confusion. Perhaps he pleaded, or perhaps pain reduced him to silence. But even in this semi-conscious condition, he must have known what was to come, and that death would not be swift. The disemboweling wasn't rushed. It was deliberate. Every cut made to prolong suffering, every twist of the knife, every caress of blade against tissue was executed for sadistic intent. The intent was to keep him alive long enough for Dereham to experience every painful moment. His body was destroyed, but his awareness was extended as long as possible. This was not a typical hanging. This was a message from Henry VIII to all corners of his kingdom. Those who taint the crown, however slight the transgression, will be punished without pity. The torturer began cold-bloodedly. A deep but not fatal cut was inflicted along Francis Dereham's abdomen, not to kill, but enough to initiate torture. Life-sustaining organs were spared so that Dereham would remain conscious while the real horror ensued. His bowels were extracted slowly from his very body alive, an agony that cannot be put into words. Witnesses to the executions described the victim's screams like Dereham's as being heard for miles. And they did not quickly disappear from consciousness. They were the type of sounds which would remain in one's head for decades, crying that were not easily forgotten, which caused deep trauma to hardened onlookers. Then came the next phase, castration. This wasn't just another layer of physical torment. It was humiliation weaponized. For Dereham, it carried deeply symbolic weight. His punishment stemmed from having once shared an intimate relationship with Catherine Howard. The removal of his manhood was Henry VIII's brutal, symbolic attempt to erase that past, to strip away even the memory of their love. The people, as horrified as they were, understood the message. When Dereham's severed genitals were held up by the executioner for everyone to see before being thrown into the fire, it was not just a display, it was a message. And Dereham, who still lived, had to see it all. Having his own body burned before his eyes was probably the most psychologically agonizing part of the experience. By that time, Dereham was not just physically destroyed, he was spiritually devastated. The fire, the smoke, the foul smell of burning flesh. It wasn't just a gruesome show. It was a symbolic preview of hellfire, a warning of eternal damnation in the religious culture of Tudor England. And finally, after all the horror, there was the one act that could be termed mercy, the beheading. Dereham was barely alive by this point, his body mutilated, his mind most likely shattered. One stroke of the executioner's axe put an end to the torture, not from mercy, but as the final act in a series of acts meant to have maximum impact. His head was held up for the people to behold, the once handsome face now twisted in agony, a gruesome warning to anyone who would ever presume to lay hands on the king's pride. But Henry VIII was not finished. And then there was quartering, his body cut into 4 parts with deliberate purpose, each limb to be shown in a different location in London. A grisly ritual designed to spread the terror far from the site of execution. The attention to the dismemberment, the strategic selection of display points, it was designed to terrify. Dereham's head was impaled on London Bridge, where it remained until stripped to bare bone by scavengers and the elements. His limbs, ripped from his torso, were mounted on gates and city walls, with London itself becoming a canvas of royal vengeance. These grisly leftovers were a ghastly warning. This is what happens to anyone who crosses the king. Even after the crowd had gone home, the shock lingered. Contemporary accounts tell of a city collectively left in shock. Many in the crowd, public execution veterans though they were, had been shaken to their cores. There were nightmares, nausea, and sleepless and appetiteless days to come. Londoners, hardened to violence though they were unsettled in a way they never before had been. And that, of course, was the intention. The execution of Francis Dereham had achieved its grisly purpose. It was a display of absolute power, so violent, so unforgettable, that it seared itself into the mind of a nation. But somehow, compounding the cruelty even further, was the fact that it was compared to another man, Thomas Culpeper. Also accused of adultery with Queen Catherine Howard, and during her marriage at that, Culpeper had been offered a relatively swift and painless death by simple beheading. His crime was possibly greater than Dereham's, yet his death was clean, his suffering slight. The disproportion in their fates wasn't arbitrary. It was strategic. Henry's anger blazed most hotly for those who had possessed his wife before him, men who, in his imagination, had stolen something sacred. Dereham's fate wasn't about justice. It was about vengeance, and through his death, Henry VIII revealed not just his power, but the depth of his paranoia, insecurity, and capacity for cruelty. While Thomas Culpeper's alleged affair with Queen Catherine Howard took place during her marriage, an act of undeniable betrayal, it was Francis Dereham's past relationship with her that struck a far more dangerous blow to Henry VIII's pride. In the warped reasoning of the king, Dereham had been more than a lover. He had stolen something the crown believed belonged to it. To Henry, this was more than adultery. It was theft, a theft of honor, innocence, and royal property, and it demanded punishment as cruel as the wound it caused his pride. Eyewitnesses offer grisly testimony to the public reaction to Dereham's execution. Spectators who routinely made executions a social event were horrified into silence. Some fainted. Others ran off before the execution was complete, too nauseated by the prolonged savagery. The crowd, usually raucous and stoical, now turned away, covering their faces as the horror ran its course. Even the executioner, a death agent who was used to violence, was reported to have hesitated, he himself visibly upset at the brutality of what he was being asked to perform. That says a lot about the harshness of this penalty. The horror of the spectacle didn't stop at England's borders. International observers were appalled. Foreign ambassadors dispatched scathing reports back to their home courts. The Holy Roman Emperor's representative wrote with disbelief, noting that even the worst criminals in Europe were spared such cruelty. These reports helped fuel Henry VIII's dark reputation across the continent, not just as a ruthless ruler, but as a tyrant whose violence defied civilized norms. And, lastly, the most terrifying effect of all was the psychological effect this action had on Henry himself. Far from being redeemed or restored, the king's behavior following the executions of Dereham, Culpeper, and Catherine Howard grew more erratic, suspicious, paranoid. England's fair reputation for justice was traded in for a darker one, a reputation for a cruelty-ridden nation. The specter of such executions shadowed English diplomacy for generations, to ensconce a vision of Henry VIII as not a great king, but a tyrant whose punishments were unreasoning. Compared to the punishment of traitors elsewhere in Europe, the contrast was extreme, for in fact, treason was punished all over the continent, but rarely with such ritualistic and systematic cruelty. England was anomalous, a monarchy where violence was not only a method, it was spectacle, a ritualized humiliation intended to terrorize subject and spectator alike. The gender politics surrounding Derham's execution add yet another complication to this tragedy. His execution sent a harsh, threatening message. Men with romantic or sexual ties to next-generation queens could be made vulnerable to not just shame, but death. It was an appalling exercise in patriarchal control, visiting violence against men to assert possession of women. Catherine Howard's lovers were destroyed not for what they had done, but for what she became. And finally, there is the genius of dark Tudor execution science. The equipment used, the hooks, the knives, the ropes, the flames, demonstrated an ill-making evolution. These were no random instruments. They were deliberately built to cause maximum agony and prolong awareness. The same technical ingenuity and artistry that made clocks and castles had, at the behest of the crown, been turned toward perfecting torture. It was innovation in the service of fear. The gruesome sight of Francis Derham's execution did more than show royal indignation. It revealed the severe class hierarchy intrinsic in Tudor punishment itself. Nobles, by virtue, were treated to swift beheadings. But for men like Derham, commoners or those who wounded royal pride in intimately precise manners, death was drawn out, choreographed, and appallingly brutal. His fate wasn't so much about the offense, but who he was and what his life meant to the king. Derham's position in society and past familiarity with the queen left him in a position where mercy didn't exist. He was the perfect candidate for a desperate king who wanted to hold on to his precarious honor. The psychological shock waves rippled through the Tudor court. Courtiers, already treading carefully, became even more guarded, haunted by the realization that even distant ties to royal disgrace could be fatal. Relationships were scrutinized. Past indiscretions became potential death warrants. A cold paranoia began to settle over Henry VIII's inner circle, shaping a court defined by silence, suspicion, and survival. Legally, the trial of Derham redrew the boundaries of treason in England. In regarding the hiding of personal background as treason against royal honor, the king gained an entirely new instrument, one that could be used to prosecute almost anything. This very wide and ominous precedent didn't pass with Henry's reign. It echoed on, influencing English law for centuries to come and making it easier to abuse power under the cloak of formal legality. The ethical and theological issues his death raised lingered far longer than the fires that consumed his body. Could such suffering ever be justified? Did earthly monarchs have the authority to unleash such torment? During the years, those uncertainties contributed to far more serious debate regarding monarchical authority, godly justice, and ultimate restraints placed upon the throne by constitutional transformation. The testimony we have of Derham's killing is chilling in its detail. They are more than a grim timetable. There is evidence they represent the intent behind each knife, each cord, each flame. His body was a surface upon which the crown wrote its darkest symbols: power, ownership, obedience, or death. Modern historians have used these records to follow the psychological trajectory of political violence. Derham's tale has been used as an icon in describing how states use extreme suffering in order to exercise power, to terrify, to subdue. So his execution is more than a note about the past. It's a prism to view power and suffering across time. The revolting innovation of Tudor methods of execution also discloses the revolting truth. Human ingenuity is not always for the common good. The scientific precision utilized to prolong Derham's suffering wasn't accidental. It was the result of specialist knowledge deliberately applied to kill a man, painfully, systematically, completely. Francis Derham's death left a legacy written in fear, trauma, and memory. He became a symbol, not only of Henry VIII's cruelty, but of what happens when absolute power is left unchecked. His execution was more than punishment. It was political theater at its most savage, and its echoes helped shape a future in which kings would eventually be bound by law and subjects protected by rights. Reflecting upon the horrific final hours of Francis Dereham, we are confronted with the very worst of human government. His murder was not justice. It was law employed as an instrument of domination. It was power without compassion. Recalling Derham's ordeal does more than it laments his death. It recommits us to the principles that push back against tyranny. We are reminded why legal safeguards, accountability, and rule of law matter. His story is a warning chiseled into history. When the ego of one man becomes the law of the land, no one is safe.